April 1848, a note was found on a deserted island in the middle of the Arctic desert. It reported that 2 British ships were trapped in ice. Their captain had died. More than 100 sailors abandoned their ships and set out on foot across the icy wasteland. After that, they disappeared. None of the 129 expedition members returned home. No one ever revealed what really happened. But the most terrifying thing is that the mystery didn't end with their disappearance. Subsequent search expeditions found human remains, abandoned camps, and strange evidence hinting at a desperate struggle for survival. Today, the story of Franklin's expedition is considered one of the most mysterious tragedies in the history of navigation. What happened to the crew? Why were these experienced sailors doomed? And what secrets did the Arctic ice hide for almost 170 years? In the mid-19th century, the British Empire controlled a vast portion of the world, but there was one problem. Trade routes between Europe and Asia were long and expensive. Many explorers dreamed of finding a shortcut through the Arctic, the so-called Northwest Passage. Only a few blank spots remained on the maps. The British Admiralty decided to settle the matter once and for all. For the mission, they chose one of the most famous polar explorers of his time, Sir John Franklin. He was nearly 60 years old. Some thought he was too old for such a dangerous journey, but his reputation was flawless. The preparation was enormous. 2 powerful ships were assigned to the expedition, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. They had already taken part in Antarctic expeditions and were considered extremely reliable. The vessels were equipped with the latest technology. On board were steam engines, heating systems, and vast supplies of food. Many believed this expedition was practically invincible. In the summer of 1845, the ships left England. On board were 129 men. They were confident they would go down in history. They had no idea that none of them would ever see their home again. The first months of the voyage went smoothly. The expedition was spotted several times by whaling ships. The last sighting was in July 1845, off the coast of Greenland. After that, they vanished completely. A year passed. Then, a second year. No news, no letters, no messages. At first, the authorities weren't too worried. Arctic expeditions often stayed away for years. But then, it became clear that something terrible had happened. In 1848, a massive search began. One rescue expedition after another set out for the Arctic. The world watched with great interest, but instead of answers, the searchers found only more riddles. The most important discovery was made on King William Island. There, searchers found a metal cylinder containing a note. The first message was written in May 1847. It said that everything was going well. The ships were wintering in the ice. No problems. But later, another note was added in the margins. It completely changed the situation. According to it, The ships had remained icebound for nearly 2 years. Sir John Franklin was dead. By then, 24 men had perished. The remaining 105 sailors decided to abandon the vessels. They planned to head south on foot. This note became the last official evidence of the expedition's existence. After that, silence. And this is where the main question is born. What could possibly force a crew to leave relatively safe ships and march into the Arctic wasteland? As the years passed without a single word from the expedition, concern turned into alarm. What had begun as a routine Arctic mission was rapidly becoming one of the greatest mysteries of the age. In 1848, the British Admiralty launched a massive search operation. Ship after ship was sent north into the frozen wilderness. Explorers risked their lives navigating dangerous ice fields, hoping to find any trace of Franklin and his men. Newspapers across Britain followed every development. The public became obsessed with the fate of the missing expedition. Over the following decade, dozens of search missions would scour the Arctic. It became the largest search effort in the history of Arctic exploration. Yet, with every new expedition came more questions than answers. The Arctic was keeping its secrets. For years, search teams found almost nothing. No survivors, no ships, no clear answers. Then, on King William Island, they discovered something extraordinary. A small metal cylinder. Inside it was a note. At first glance, the message seemed reassuring. Written in May 1847, it stated that the expedition was wintering safely in the ice. Everything appeared normal. The ships were secure. The crew was alive. There was no indication of disaster. But then, investigators noticed something unusual. Written later in the margins was a second message, a desperate update, one that changed everything. As the new text emerged, the scale of the catastrophe became clear. The ships had been trapped in the ice for nearly 2 years. 24 men were already dead. And then came the line that stunned everyone who read it. Sir John Franklin died on June 11th, 1847. The leader of the expedition was gone. The mission was collapsing, and the remaining 105 men had made a fateful decision. They would abandon the ships and attempt to escape across the Arctic wilderness on foot. This was the last official message ever recovered from the Franklin expedition. After this note, there was only silence. The journey ahead was almost unimaginable. 105 men now faced the Arctic on foot. Somewhere to the south lay the nearest hope of rescue. Between them and survival stretched hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness. There were no roads, no settlements, no maps accurate enough to guide them through the endless ice. Only snow, wind, and the bitter cold. Each man was already weakened by months trapped in the Arctic, yet they were forced to haul heavy sledges loaded with supplies across rough terrain. Progress was painfully slow. Every step demanded energy they could scarcely afford to spend. The temperature regularly plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Powerful winds cut through clothing and exposed skin. Food became increasingly scarce, and with each passing day, the men grew weaker. The Arctic seemed endless, a frozen world without mercy, a place where a single mistake could mean death. Still, they pushed forward, driven by hope, driven by survival, driven by the belief that somewhere beyond the horizon, rescue awaited them. But as the days turned into weeks, that hope began to fade. The men were not simply fighting distance. They were fighting hunger, exhaustion, disease, and one of the harshest environments on Earth. With every mile they traveled, the odds of survival grew smaller. The Arctic was slowly claiming them. As search teams followed the trail left behind by Franklin's men, they began to uncover a series of strange discoveries. Abandoned boats, broken sledges, scattered belongings frozen into the Arctic landscape. But some of the items made little sense. Among the supplies were silver spoons, fine tableware, books, even personal luxury items. Discoveries puzzled investigators. By this point, the men were fighting for their lives. Every extra pound meant more energy spent pulling sledges through snow and ice. So, why carry objects that offered no chance of survival? Why not leave them behind? Some historians believe the sailors still hoped they would be rescued. Others suggest they were trying to preserve a sense of order and normality in the middle of a disaster. Perhaps these objects reminded them of home, of civilization, of a world that felt increasingly distant. Or perhaps the crew simply could not accept how desperate their situation had become. Whatever the reason, these strange possessions became some of the most haunting clues left behind by the Franklin expedition. Silent evidence of men caught between hope and reality. Men who were walking deeper into one of the greatest tragedies in Arctic history. By this point, the situation had become catastrophic. Food supplies were nearly gone. The men were exhausted by the cold, disease, and endless marches across the frozen wilderness. Every new day became a struggle for survival. According to Inuit accounts, some of the sailors could barely walk. They collapsed directly into the snow and never rose again. The Arctic wind slowly erased their tracks. The frozen wilderness was swallowing everything that remained of the expedition. Years later, search parties began uncovering traces of the crew's final days. Abandoned camps, broken boats, the remains of men who never made it to safety. But one discovery, in particular, shocked researchers. Some of the recovered bones showed unusual cut marks, marks that raised difficult and disturbing questions. For decades, scientists studied the remains, trying to understand what had happened during the expedition's final weeks. Gradually, a grim picture began to emerge. The men had found themselves in conditions no one could truly prepare for. Without food, without hope of rescue, without any way back. Today, many historians believe that the final days of the Franklin expedition became an extreme test of human endurance. There, among the endless snow and ice, ordinary ideas of duty, morality, and survival collided with the brutal reality of the Arctic. We may never know exactly what happened in those final camps, but one thing is certain: the last weeks of the Franklin expedition were far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. For more than a century, historians have debated a simple question: what actually killed the Franklin expedition? Was it hunger, disease, or something far more unexpected? Today, most researchers believe there was no single cause. Instead, the crew may have been overwhelmed by a deadly combination of disasters. The first and most obvious explanation is starvation. As the ships remained trapped in the ice year after year, food supplies gradually ran out. Hunting in the Arctic was difficult, especially for exhausted men, weakened by months of hardship. By the time the crew abandoned the ships, many were already struggling to survive. The second theory is scurvy. For centuries, scurvy was one of the deadliest diseases faced by sailors. Caused by a severe lack of vitamin C, it slowly destroys the body's ability to heal itself. Victims suffer weakness, bleeding gums, joint pain, and extreme fatigue. Even the strongest sailor could become almost incapable of walking. And then there's the most controversial theory of all: lead poisoning. When scientists examined the remains of several crew members, they discovered unusually high levels of lead in their bones and tissues. Some researchers believe the source may have been poorly manufactured canned food. Others point to the ship's water distillation systems. Lead poisoning can affect both the body and the mind. It can cause weakness, confusion, poor judgment, and difficulty making decisions. In an environment as unforgiving as the Arctic, even small mistakes could become fatal. So, what was the real cause? The most likely answer is all of the above. The ice trapped the ships. Food supplies dwindled. Disease spread through the crew. Possible lead exposure weakened them further. And as conditions worsened, their chances of survival disappeared. It was not one disaster. It was a chain of disasters, a slow collapse that unfolded over months and eventually claimed every single member of the expedition. For more than a century, the Franklin expedition remained one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The Arctic had swallowed the ships. The crew was gone, and many believed the full story would never be known. But in the 21st century, a new generation of investigators returned to the frozen north. Armed with modern technology, they set out to solve a mystery that had endured for nearly 170 years. Archaeologists, historians, and Arctic explorers began searching the same waters that had trapped Franklin's ships. Satellite imagery, advanced sonar systems, underwater robots, tools the original explorers could never have imagined. Year after year, researchers combed the Arctic seabed. The search was difficult. The conditions remained as unforgiving as ever. Ice still covered vast areas of the ocean. Storms frequently interrupted operations, yet the teams pressed on. Every new expedition brought them closer to the truth. Then, after decades of searching, something extraordinary appeared beneath the icy waters. A shape, a silhouette, the outline of a ship resting silently on the Arctic floor. For the first time in generations, the mystery was beginning to reveal its secrets, and what researchers discovered next would astonish the world. For decades, the fate of Franklin's ships remained unknown. Many believed they had been crushed by the ice and lost forever beneath the Arctic Ocean. Then, in September 2014, a breakthrough finally came. After years of searching, researchers discovered a shipwreck resting on the seafloor of Queen Maud Gulf. It was HMS Erebus, one of the two vessels that had vanished nearly 170 years earlier. The discovery shocked historians around the world. Against all expectations, the wreck was remarkably well preserved. The cold Arctic waters had protected it for generations. As underwater cameras explored the site, details slowly emerged from the darkness. Cannons, deck structures, artifacts untouched for more than a century and a half. For the first time since 1845, Franklin's lost expedition was no longer just a legend. It had become a real place, a frozen time capsule hidden beneath the Arctic waters. The discovery confirmed that the ships had survived far longer than many experts had believed. But even more importantly, it offered hope. Hope that the final chapter of the Franklin expedition might still be waiting to be uncovered. And researchers knew there was one more mystery left to solve: the location of the second ship, HMS Terror. For nearly 170 years, the fate of HMS Terror remained one of the greatest mysteries in maritime history. Many believed the ship had been crushed by ice and lost forever beneath the Arctic waters. But in 2016, the impossible happened. Deep beneath the cold, dark waters of the Canadian Arctic, researchers discovered the wreck of Terror, and what they found was astonishing. The ship was remarkably well preserved. Its hull remained largely intact. Windows, cabins, and entire sections of the vessel had survived in conditions that seemed frozen in time. As underwater cameras slowly moved through the wreck, it felt less like a shipwreck and more like a time capsule, a silent witness to one of history's most tragic expeditions. For the first time in generations, historians were able to look directly at the vessel where the final chapter of the Franklin expedition may have unfolded. Yet, despite this extraordinary discovery, many questions remain unanswered. What happened during the crew's final days aboard the ship? Why was Terror found where it was? And what secrets may still be hidden inside its dark and frozen interior? The wreck revealed part of the story, but the Arctic is still holding on to the rest. Today, we know far more about the Franklin expedition than the searchers of the 19th century ever could. We know where the ships ended their journey. We know that the crew fought to survive against impossible odds. And we know that the Arctic proved stronger than one of the most advanced expeditions of its time. But despite all the discoveries, the most important questions remain unanswered. What were the final thoughts of the men who marched into the frozen wilderness? What happened during their last days? And what secrets are still locked away beneath the ice? Perhaps one day, new discoveries will reveal the truth. But until then, the Franklin expedition remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Because sometimes, the darkest mysteries of history are not hidden in ancient ruins. They are lying right in front of us, beneath the Arctic ice.